All right. Good evening and good night, and welcome to the It's Your Perspective Talk Show. It is Wednesday, July 20th, 2016. My name is David, a.k.a. Kimber, a.k.a. Christian, alongside
Bingy Soup.
Yeah, Soup, we back?
Yes, I.
Yeah, we're back again, man. We had a 2 or 3 day stint there on the road, doing some videotaping and all that kind of stuff, but we're back. I just want to say that this is the It's Your Perspective Talk Show every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, weekly, 8 p.m. until. We do have a telephone number tonight, 340-201-9005. You can also text us on that number as well. But most importantly, you have to go to our website, streaming live from the vi.com. Go to that website, click on the tab that says Watch Us Live, and you'll be able to see the show tonight because we do have a special guest in the studio tonight. If you're too shy to call or text, hit us up an email, streaming live from the vi@yahoo.com. That'll pop up right here on my computer here. We'll be able to get your question or your comment on the show. For our guest tonight, we are in a high-tech, low-tech studio, coming to you from an undisclosed location here in St. Croix, Virgin Islands. No radio or TV, internet only, which means you have to get your iOS, your Android, your tablet, your iPad, your Mac, your Windows, or your Linux computer. Open up your browser, type in streaming live from the vi.com, and you'll be able to see the show tonight. All our recorded live shows are on YouTube and Ustream.tv. Just search for our channel, It's Your Perspective Talk Show. We have 2 Facebook pages. Super and I want to give a quick shout out to CHS class of 1982. That's the year that we're representing. Hit us up if you're out there. But most importantly, to all our past guests, thanks for being on the show. We're on Twitter as well. VI Perspective is how you tweet with us there. And we're moving straight forward and up. The show's mission is just to inform, entertain, and empower everyone. I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors, Maggie's Party Decor and Supersonic Computer Services. And also we have to add Add a Touch Boutique in Sunny Isles Shopping Center, Mini Mall. That's right. Check out Joanna. Got some nice stuff for the ladies there. And check out our website for the contact information, telephone number, and all that kind of stuff. And Soup, you ready?
Yes, I.
Bless that mic, man.
Greetings to one and all. Hope everyone had a blessed night in Almighty Rastafari lives. The greatest secret in life is that reality is nothing more than illusion. The physical world does not exist outside of our own belief system and the filter of our own mind. We are, in fact, subparticles of the Most High experiencing creation itself. But as subparticles, we have swayed over these creations. Everything you have experienced in life, every event, occurrence, object, and person is nothing more than a figment of your own thoughts, beliefs, and words. The problem is, most of us are still asleep. When you understand this, your entire world shifts and you come to realize the true meaning of life is thus like a lucid dream. We have total control.
Yes, I Soup. Thanks for blessing us again with the It's Your Perspective poem. Soup's blessing us from the very beginning, back in April of 2014. I want to thank him for that, man. So, as promised, as we posted online today through Facebook, we do have a special guest in the studio. There he is, Dr. Jeffrey P. Perry. He is in the studio. Doc, wave to the crowd. The viewers, fans, relatives are seeing you live right now. So how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, and thank both you, David, Soup, very much. I'm very pleased to be here and have an opportunity to share some information on Hubert Harrison with your audience.
Okay, perfect, man. So Soup and I had an opportunity to meet you last night at an event at the Wim Great House. They have the big event going on. It's actually still going on this week, this whole entire week from Sunday to Sunday. Come home to St. Croix,
2016.
And Dr. Perry was there last night. Because he had some very informative information about someone actually I never heard of, and he's going to continue in a sense on with the conversation a little bit and just kind of share some stuff. But St. Croix born Hubert H. Harrison, the father of Harlem Radicalism. Tell us a little bit about that.
Just introduce yourself and just go from there, Jeff.
Okay. I've been working on Hubert Harrison since 1981, for over 30 years. And Hubert Harrison was born on Estate Concordia in 1883, Estate Concordia East. And he lives in St. Croix until 1900 and goes to New York. He is a brilliant intellectual and an extraordinary radical. He is one of the major black figures of the 20th century. And unfortunately, both in the U.S. and even down here, people are only beginning to learn about him and his importance. Although when he was alive, people knew how important he was.
Okay.
I'm going to briefly describe who he was as an intellectual and as a radical activist, and then I want to recount a little of his life, particularly his Crucian roots and some things. So if we can go along there, but interrupt at any time.
Okay.
I'll take the cues. But so as an intellectual, the Jamaica-born historian J.A. Rogers, in World's Great Men of Color, which has gone through 8 reprint editions, describes Hubert Harrison as perhaps the foremost Afro-American intellect of his era. That's amidst chapters on Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter, and Marcus Garvey. It's extraordinarily high praise, and he adds that he was the one with the sanest program. That's very important.
Right.
Now, as an intellectual, and let me preface, if I may, just these comments. I have a web page which has all kinds of free information on Hubert Harrison. It is www.jeffreybperry.net.
Just like your name.
Yes, audio, video, articles, and so you can find much there. And I've done 3 books on Harrison so far. One is volume 1 of his 2-volume biography. It's Hubert Harrison, The Voice of Harlem Radicalism, 1883 to 1918. I'm working on volume 2. The first volume is over 600 pages, has 116 pages of notes, 60 photos with detailed captions. It's Columbia University Press. You can read on the website all the comments from leading scholars and activists whose names you'll know.
Right.
He's a giant, as I emphasized. We also have a book from Wesleyan University Press, a Hubert Harrison Reader, which has 138 of the 700 articles Harrison wrote before he died at age 44. And then most recently I came out for Diasporic Africa Press with a new edition of Hubert Harrison's 1920 book, When Africa Awakes, the inside story of the stirrings and strivings of the new Negro in the Western world. I believe all those books, there still might be copies at St.Croix, at WIM, in their bookstore. They had a lot that were sold last night, but there are some on island right there. But people can look for these online and access them, ebook or get print editions. Now, on Harrison as intellectual, what I was talking about earlier, when he arrives in New York, he's an immigrant. He's lost both his parents. He has an older sister. He's 17 years old. He's working 5 days a week, a couple nights, and he goes to school the other 2 nights. And one of the New York daily newspapers runs an article, Genius Found in West Indian Pupil. He got citywide honors in several subjects. They'd never seen it. He's barely going to school, and he's getting citywide honors. That was a sign of what was to come. Harrison is an autodidact, what we see in Malcolm X later on. He's self-educated. He did not let things like the lack of money or the lack of access to a university education hinder him in any way. He read all the time, and he wrote wonderful essays like read, and he stressed this for others. And it really gives his intellectual work a great degree of integrity, I feel, as I come to know him. Now, he read voraciously. When he died, some of the accounts said he read multiple books in a day. At first, I was a little not sure if that was true, but having gone through his papers, I see he knew how to aggressively attack a book, hone in, focus on what was important, mark it, and move on.
Right.
He, as an orator, Hubert Harrison pioneered tradition of soapbox oratory in Harlem, which is later picked up by A. Philip Randolph, Richard B. Moore from Barbados, Marcus Garvey, and much later Malcolm X. Harrison was the pioneer, and he was a giant. We have accounts of him speaking before 40,000 people in Union Square in 1914.
40,000, you
yes.
said?
In 1912, he goes down to Broad Street and Wall Street and lectures for 3 hours as far as the voice could reach in what I refer to now as an early Occupy Wall Street, right?
Yes.
So he's an and he spoke widely. He spoke on history, science, religion, politics, race, class, theology. Just an extraordinary mind. He also he also wrote 2 books, The Negro and the Nation in 1917 and the When Africa Wakes book in 1920. What's very important is Harrison was an extraordinary journalist. He edits and publishes The Voice, the first newspaper of the New Negro movement in 1917. He is the founder of the New Negro movement. And for people not familiar, and let me step back for a second. In Harrison's day, he led in the effort to use the word Negro with a capital N as a sign of race pride and against all the white supremacist derogatives and other names that would be used. Marcus Garvey functioned similarly, and his newspaper was the Negro World. They led in a struggle to capitalize Negro, write it with a capital N. In the 60s, there was a change when I'm growing up, and people moved to various, to black, to African American, Afro-Caribbean, African, various names.
Right.
But back then, the big effort, which Harrison was a leader in, was in the capitalization event. So he edits The Voice, the first newspaper of the New Negro movement. In 1919, he edits a newspaper called the New Negro, a journal called the New Negro. And in 1920, he becomes the principal editor of Marcus Garvey's Negro World, when that paper, under Harrison's editorship, sweeps the globe.
Right.
And Harrison describes how he reshapes it. It's one of the thrilling stories in the history of black journalism. So he's an extraordinary journalist. He's an extraordinary orator. He also, although he never goes to college a day in his life, in the 1920s, he's a lecturer for the Board of Education of New York. He's the only black educator. All the rest are from these colleges, from City College, from New York University, from Columbia University, for their adult education program. Wonderful range of courses he's teaching. And he was a great bibliophile, a collector of books, and he tried to build, encourage people to read, but build public libraries. He felt that free public libraries were one of the great institutions in the U.S., and he is one of the co-founders with Arthur Schomburg of the Schomburg Center in New York, what grew into the Schomburg Center,
right.
which is on 135th Street in Harlem and is probably the major black reference research library in the world.
Yes,
and what people should know, if they don't know already, I think people would be interested in knowing, is Schomburg, who's born in Puerto Rico, so he's Afro-Boricua. His mother is a Mary Joseph from St. Croix, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So we've got these Crucian roots that are so central to development of things in Harlem. So that's a brief overview of Harrison as he is also, let me not forget, he is also the first, his phrase was the first regular black book reviewer in Negro newspaperdom. In the black press, he's the first person to do regular book reviews. We've located about 70 of his book reviews. They're extraordinary. The Nobel Prize winner Eugene O'Neill writes to Harrison after Harrison writes a review and says, "This is as fine a piece as I've seen. Any theater I have anything to do with,
Yes.
you will have a role in." Now, why this is important and why I want people here to know about this and maybe carry it further, Harrison is not taught in any courses on black literature or book reviewing or anything like that. And this new Negro movement, which I'm going to get into, which he founds, is like the Black Power movement of the 1960s. Let me move into that. Harrison is a radical.
But
Yeah.
how did he excel at that? How did he, if he didn't have any kind of formal education,
Right.
and is critiquing books, and
Yeah.
how does he excel at that? I mean,
Very good question, and thank you. First, he read, the phrase was, when he died, they said he read omnivorously, whatever he could get his hands on. He
Okay.
read all the time, and there, you see that, it's clear. He left scrapbooks His scrapbooks, all his papers are now at Columbia University, where there's a 102-page finding aid. If people go online, they can read.
Those scrapbooks?
Yeah, and his writings, you know, everything that went there. And his scrapbooks are an extraordinary collection. He had about 45. The way I wound up processing the papers, I met his family after a librarian in St. Thomas, Miss Lindquist, told me they were alive in New York. I tracked down the family. On the third meeting, they gave me his papers to use, and so I processed them all before they were placed. And his scrapbooks are an extraordinary. There were bits of 45, some were complete, and you'd turn in. This is how he did files back then. Today people do digital files, but back then he'd take an old magazine, put a couple, because he lives in poverty, and he would paste inside clippings from newspapers and or his articles, and he broke it down into all these sections: Africa, Caribbean, my life, my history, theology. You know, it just he was a very organized thinker. He had a great memory. He had a great memory when he read, and he talks at one or 2 points on how when he would write, he'd often write just one draft. I'm quite different. I have to go over things 10, 20 times, and every time I do, I find, you know, a little something. Yeah, but he's extraordinary, and it's not just Rogers who says he's brilliant. Everybody who came in contact with him. James Weldon Johnson, who people may know as the author of the Negro National Anthem, when he sees Harrison speak on the street corner, he says, "We need to have you speaking full-time in Harlem. Your lectures, your outdoor lectures would be like a year course in a major university," right? And again, there's many quotes like this. So in partial answer to your question, he read all the time. He's also nurtured, and I'm going to get into that, he's nurtured with other black intellectual working class people, and this is crucial. Maybe I'll jump to that for a second. Down in St. Croix, he is nurtured, well, we'll maybe do more of his history later, but he has the benefit of a wonderful teacher, exposure to a wonderful teacher, Wilfred Jackson, D. Hamilton Jackson's father,
yes.
Who was considered the best teacher on the island, as the phrase went, black or white. And Harrison learned from him. Harrison had access to the library. He just was persistent in his quest for learning at St. John's Episcopal Church in Christiansted. He'd go in there and he'd read. And in the schools, he worked, you know, he'd rush to school. His sister talks about him falling and developing a lisp because he tried to get to class. You know, he was so eager to get to class. And even when he's in school, he served as an under teacher below the principal teacher to work with the younger children, so he was bright. Yes. All these signs are there. When he comes to New York, he has the benefit of a great circle of black working class intellectuals. And they met in New York in the first decade of the 20th century at St. Benedict the Moor Church on 53rd Street and St. Mark's AME Church on 53rd Street. And there were people like Schomburg, John E. Bruce, who's a leading black journalist, and they would meet at St. Benedict's. And Harrison, and on the slides I showed last night, Harrison describes the atmosphere at St. Benedict's as the germ of black racial consciousness. How they would come together and they would meet, they'd have speakers, they'd have discussions, but they also learned how to speak openly, not bite their tongue, and, you know, and bring it, but yet they could be friends afterward. It's the type of intellectual atmosphere that I encourage everyone to build today. This is what we need. We've got serious problems, we got to address them. So he's nurtured in all that, and it was the same at St. Mark's AME Church, the same atmosphere. So that's where he's getting his education, right? Okay. And it can be still done. And this is why he's an inspiration for people who maybe don't get the chance to go to college or don't have all the benefits of wealth. So now moving to Harrison briefly, as a radical. A. Philip Randolph describes Hubert Harrison as the father of Harlem Radicalism. Other people do also. But he does that in a period when Harlem was considered the center of radical black thought, and they refer to it as the international Negro Mecca. Because people would be coming from the Caribbean, from Africa, from down south. They'd be coming to New York because it was a vibrant intellectual center, all kinds of ideas and radical thought and other thinking, right? And so Randolph, that's how Randolph describes Harrison. When we look more deeply, one of the points I make is that Hubert Harrison is the only person in U.S. history This is a man born in St. Croix, on a State Concordia. The only person in U.S. history to play leading roles in the largest class radical and the largest race radical movement of his day. He is, for a while, a leading black activist in the Socialist Party of America, and then he is the founder of the New Negro movement, the first organization and the first newspaper, and then he becomes principal editor of Marcus Garvey's Negro World. As I said, when that paper sweeps the globe, and Robert A. Hill, historian for Marcus Garvey and the Garvey papers, Jamaica-born Robert A. Hill, is very clear that the Garvey movement was a component part of the New Negro movement, right? So Harrison is, what I argue in my books, is amongst the class radicals, he's the most race conscious. Amongst the race radicals, he's the most class conscious. He is also an extraordinary radical internationalist. Winston James, a wonderful historian who's written a book, Holding Aloft the Banner of Ethiopia, about early 20th century Caribbean radicalism, points out that Hubert Harrison, amongst his generation, knew more about Africa and spoke and wrote more knowledgeably than any of his contemporaries, but he did so without the arrogance that so often comes from people in the United States to people from Africa. Well, I have Indian scholars who've written to me and say that what Hubert Harrison writes on India in the period around 1919 is the best they see coming out of the U.S. Harrison starts the West Indian news notes in Garvey's paper in the Negro World. Yes. The West Indian news notes. He starts the Poetry for the People, the book review sections. Just extraordinary contributions he's making. But going on with Harrison as a radical. So Harrison plays these major roles, and he is, by the accounts of his contemporaries, Hubert Harrison is the major radical influence on A. Philip Randolph and the major radical influence on Marcus Garvey. This is profound. Now, people should know this. Now, if you take those lines of descent down, it is A. Philip Randolph who marches with Martin Luther King Jr. in the March on Washington in 1963. Right. And it is Marcus Garvey who, Malcolm X's mother is a reporter for the Negro World, the same Garvey paper that Harrison was the principal editor of. Right. And his father is a Garveyite preacher. Yeah. So the key radicals of the civil rights black liberation struggle when I'm growing up, Martin and Malcolm, come back down through into Harrison. This is, people should know this. They should take pride in it. They should spread it. They should learn from it, right?
So what do you think made him such involved in what made did he ever state in any of his writings why he started to get into the social radicalism, or because of the situation, what was happening to the black man?
Indirectly. I mean, he's writing about it from the early, but some of the things, when I write the book, my biography, I talk Crucian roots and some of the things that I think were important in Harrison's development. And he's very familiar. But Harrison writes knowledgeably about African customs and traditions in St. Croix, about St. Croix's rich history of direct action struggle from the 1848 emancipation, fire burn, great labor struggles, 1879 through D. Hamilton Jackson in that period. He's familiar with that history. When he's in St. Croix, his mom is from Barbados, right? And probably with that group of immigrants that came after emancipation in Barbados in the 1840s to 60s. So he lives in a community where he also gets exposure to a broader spectrum, not just native-born people. It gives breadth to his understanding. He, as I said, he's got this great hunger for learning. He has a good black mentor. But then there is also the fact, and forgive me because when I get old, it was right there. I'll come back to it in a second. But it's very much on point with what you were asking about. Sorry. You got it.
His starting.
Right.
How he started.
Right.
What make him get in? If he ever stated in his writing what made him.
The last point I wanted to make is, and in St. Croix, he's living in poverty. He lives in Concordia, Jewish family, but he's living on plantations or the old water gut section of Christiansted, right? Okay. And he writes that I lived in poverty, and I learned to develop a feeling of oneness with those who are at the bottom of society. So he's got that from the bottom, from the beginning. Always about Hubert Harrison. Even when he goes to New York, he lives in the most densely populated block. Before he moves to Harlem, African and Afro-Caribbeans were on the west side, around where Lincoln Center is now.
Yes.
He lived in an area, 3,500 people in 5 blocks, the most densely populated area in New York, and the meanest tenements. When he moves to Harlem, he's at 231 West 134th Street, the most densely populated block in Harlem. He lives in and amongst the people. And he writes essays with much appreciation, affection about the common people, not derogatory, not looking down. And when he starts talking about we have to build race unity, he's emphasizing we've got to light the fire at the bottom. We've got to start from the bottom up, unlike Booker T. Washington, who has a Tuskegee machine, or Du Bois, who's talking from the talented 10th. And it was the same concept that Garvey develops, right? Building from the bottom.
Bottom up, yeah.
So Harrison's got that oneness. But then another thing that's crucial for Harrison's radicalization, and not just him, many of the Afro-Caribbeans who come to New York, is the contrast that they encounter when they come to New York. And I go into this in some detail in my books and the reasons for it. But very briefly, when Harrison grows up, St. Croix, for all the evils of white supremacy in the past history, when he's growing up, there's some history where there was a sector of the African population that had been promoted. There was no segregated schools, no lynching. It's a different atmosphere than he encounters when he comes to New York. When he comes to New York in 1900, he comes 3 months after New York City's 4th Great Race Riot. And Harper's Magazine, which is still published today, points out that he's living on 62nd Street. It said a black man could not walk between 42nd Street and 59th Street without fear of being seized by a mob. Right? That's how bad it was. He couldn't believe this. There was nothing like this back here.
Right.
Another key thing was lynching. The year that Harrison arrives in New York, 1900, there were at least 107 African Americans lynched. And when I do my slide presentation, I show 4 men at one time in Georgia, right?
Yes.
And every year for a decade before and decades before and decade after, you have over 100 African Americans being lynched. Today there's much protest over the killing of black people by police officers. Look at the numbers here. These are staggering numbers, right?
Very staggering.
And so Harrison is shocked. And he's not alone. Garvey talks about this, Richard B. Moore from Barbados, Claude McKay from Jamaica. And Claude McKay phrases it extremely well when he comes to the U.S. He basically says, I'm trying to paraphrase it as best I remember, I had heard of racial prejudice in this country, but I never dreamed of it being so intensely bitter.
Yeah.
And that's what they met when they came to the U.S. So they were radicalized. And also, they're coming from a tradition, and Harrison then even in early New York, it's nurtured a tradition where they learned to discuss these issues, speak out, and whereas it was difficult down south for people to do this, right? So a lot of Afro-Caribbeans play very leading roles in some of these radical movements in the early 20th century too.
And I think you mentioned too last night that too, Dr. Perry, that during that time when he was here in St. Croix too, we had black owners that owned property.
Yes.
That was one of the key things that he didn't see when he went to New York.
Right. A key difference. Let me speak a little more about these difference in how the color line is drawn. Harrison, when he's born on Estate Concordia, it's owned by 2 men of color. You would never find that in Virginia, in the U.S. When I go back and look back, to the history a little bit, and I draw a contrast between St. Croix and the U.S., to understand why these things are so different, it's very key to look at the question of social control. In St. Croix, going back, the general demographics were roughly 5% of the population were European, and even the European groups were a bit mixed, right? 80% of the black plantation labor, plantation labor is black. 15% so-called free colors, different phrases, names used, and they would often be in intermediary positions. Basically, the 5% on top couldn't control the 95%, so they tried to utilize the 15% if they could, in broad strokes. And the way this manifests itself is there was some policy of promotion to land holding for people. There was also way back when there was the, to maintain social control, there was the militia. Some free coloreds could be in the militia. And you had in St. Croix, there was struggle for it, but in 1834 there was an edict of full equality, which at least nominally granted full equality between free coloreds and Europeans. If you contrast that with the U.S., in the U.S., the situation is very different, again for social control reasons, and I go into this in great depth in a nice 2-hour YouTube video I have with lots of slides and 2 volumes I came out based on the work of Theodore W. Allen on the invention of the white race. I encourage people to look at this stuff because in the Anglo-American plantation colonies up north, Virginia and then on down, and Virginia's the pattern setter because 7 of the first 12 presidents come from Virginia. And there, for a host of reasons, which I go into, the predominance of the labor force through most of the 17th century are European plantation laborers. They're not yet called white. They're not yet, the word white doesn't appear in the Virginia colonial record till 1691. And there's much commonality of experience between European and African Americans. They fight together, they demand freedom from bondage, they kick the governor out. A rich history that, again, people aren't familiar with. But as we go back, when they then to maintain social control in the U.S., the plantation bourgeoisie, if you will, they start extending racial privileges to the Europeans, and they start extending the disabilities on the African Americans up there. So what you have when they start developing this, they invent this white race and they start developing this social control, when they set up their instrument to maintain control, it is the slave patrol. In the U.S., it's lily white. Down here, free coloreds can be. So that's another difference. And one more major thing, as opposed to an edict of full equality, as they had in St. Croix, in the United States, we have the Dred Scott decision, 1856, 1857, which says no black person has any rights that a white's bound to respect. So these are qualitative differences. And this is really another spur to Harrison's radical, but he's coming from these roots, which you know, J.A. Rogers writes a wonderful piece on Harrison, and at the end he goes through all the limitations and handicaps of poverty. Harrison's mom had been born enslaved, his father, had been born enslaved, and his grandmother. He's coming from, you know, this very humble beginning, if you will. And he becomes what people argue was the foremost Afro-American intellect. This is an extraordinary story, but it's also a great testimony to human potential, what people can do and become.
Exactly. Once you determine that.
And so it's a story we need to get out and share with people. Sorry.
Continue on.
Okay, so I've mentioned some of the things about Harrison and the early Crucian roots, and then his early development. Now, when he gets active in the Socialist Party, he writes the first major pieces on the Negro and socialism was the topic. And he starts putting forth what would become basic demands of the black left in the 20th century about the principal duty of the European American left is you got to fight against white supremacy. That's your responsibility. That he argues that the quote Negro question in the U.S. is a revolutionary question, and I want to elaborate on that in a second. It's a very important point. He understands racial oppression as socio-historic, right? It's based in the social world, right? It's not in the genes and things like this.
Yes.
And so he comes out with all this stuff which later becomes basics for the black left. But one thing he writes in 1912, and when I do my talks in New York, I usually have with me my touchstone. It's a black stone. I didn't think the TSA would let me get through airport security, so I didn't bring it. But a touchstone, Harrison writes the following. Please remember this touchstone concept. He writes, a touchstone is a black stone. First, let me explain. A touchstone is a black stone. You rub the metal against the touchstone to see if it's really the gold it's purported to be, right? So you use that metaphor to look at any issue in society. Education, employment, housing, health care, incarceration rates. Pick an issue. Let's put it to the test. How are black people faring? What are we going to do about it? It is a guide to political action. I come out of 33 years work in the post office. We did some very good work. We tried to function, however imperfectly. Every issue we looked at, we knew working people were getting hit hard, but how is it being shaped in a white supremacist fashion? How we go? It's a guide for political action. But then in that same passage, but in addition, in that same passage, Hubert Harrison writes in 1912, true equality and democracy for the Negro, this is a paraphrase, but then what he says, the rest is, quote, implies a revolution startling to even think of. And what I think he's saying there, what I think he foreshadows, is the 1960s, again, the era when I grow up,
Right.
when the civil rights, black liberation struggle was a catalyst for all social change in the U.S., for the anti-war movement, the student movement, women's movement, gay and lesbian rights, every movement, people of color. They took sustenance from the civil rights, black liberation struggle for two reasons in particular, but other reasons also. But the two reasons I always highlight are because the struggle was just and because it hit so directly at how the ruling class maintained social control in the U.S. through white supremacy. And again, on this social control, it's a crucial concept. We have to understand now the gap between rich and poor is at record proportions. I've written on my webpage, I have an article on the top left about all this, the developing conjunction, developing crisis, insights from Hubert Harrison, Theodore W. Allen on centrality of struggle of white supremacy. It lays out how in the gap between rich and poor, record proportions, working people getting crushed, compared to other major capitalist countries, U.S. working people are not doing well despite everything they're told, and how everything is shaped in a white supremacist fashion, and all that comes much harder on African Americans and stuff.
But Dr. Perry, you say, just something funny here.
Sure.
You say the article at the top left. I actually looked at that article. That's not an article. That's like 100 and something pages.
It's a PDF.
It's a PDF, exactly. Right. It's 100 and something pages.
But let me tell you a story on that one, if I may, real quick. There's a this is background. I'm going to do a sidebar. There's a group called, a publication called Daedalus. It is the American Academy of Arts and Science. All the guys in the tails and all this,
yes.
and all the leading scholars around the world. And they come out with a quarterly publication called Daedalus. And the last 4 pages, you can read what I'm going to tell you now because I lay it out. And Daedalus was going to come out for the first time because the statistics were coming out that by 2042, quote, whites would no longer be a majority due to the demographic change in the U.S. So they were going to do 2 special issues on race for the first time since 1960s when all the cities were erupting.
Right.
And John Hope Franklin had edited it. So they were going to do a series. And they wrote and asked me to write. Now, I'm outside I'm an independent scholar.
Right.
And they wrote and asked me to write. And I'm thinking, why do they want me to write? The 2 things I write about are Hubert Harrison and Theodore W. Allen, the invention of the white race. So I said, I'm going to combine them both. So, and when they ask me to write, they say, you're free to write on anything you want. And they asked me to do 2,500 words. I send it in. I'll make this short. I send it in, 2,500 words. They say, could you please double it? I double it to 5,000 words. They advertise it for 3 quarters in a row, and then to make the story real short, when it comes out, my article doesn't appear, and I ask them why, and they come out, you can read about it. They try and make up stories. Oh, we thought we told you and all this. It got pulled by the higher because I think the message was Harrison and Allen was much too radical for what they wanted. But I'm sorry I forgot. So it started out as 2,500 words, but instead of just yelling and screaming, I said, I'll show them.
Yeah. So what made you take that passion to begin with, Dr. Perry, coming from where you came from?
Okay. My family is all working people.
Okay.
Nobody. My mom may have finished high school. It's not clear, but if she did, she's the only one of my direct descendants.
Okay.
It's working people and peoples who've been, faced their own oppressions. Right? The Irish by the English is a very historic, vicious oppression. Some on one side, some Slavs. That's where the word in English is derived from. And so I come from that background, and I grow up in the New York, North Jersey area. I can get very specific into it. I'm born in the Bronx, but my family moves to North Jersey on the GI Bill. This is all part of the white supremacist shaping of U.S. The GI Bill, they awarded 67,000 homes after World War II to former GIs. Only of 67,000 New York, New Jersey area, only 100 go to families of color. That's how you get the ring of lily white suburbs around New York and every city in the country.
Wow.
I go into this in those articles.
Yes.
So that's where my family moves. I grow up there, but I'm always a little bit like Harrison. I'm starting to question and do a lot of things. And make the story short, I get to go I play sports when I'm young. Doesn't look it, I know, but I did. You guys may have too. Who knows? And I get to go to college. And I'm just getting exposed more. I get to travel. I'm young. I have $600. I go by land for 6 months all the way down to Argentina and back. It opens my eyes quite a bit more, right?
Okay.
You know, $600 a day living.
Yes.
I talk to people. I get to go to Cuba when I'm young, right?
Okay.
And that was a very progressive thing compared to the rest of Latin America. I'm getting politicized by all the civil rights, black liberation struggle, the student movement, all in that period. And then I go into the labor movement, which is where I worked for 33 years. And that's a conscious choice, you know. And so it's a lot of those things. And also I'm reading all the time. So this fellow, Theodore W. Allen, who writes, he pioneers what they call white privilege analysis way back in '65. It's not the stuff that's out there today. His is a class-based analysis. Encourage people to read him. But I'm exposed to all this. I'm active. I do work, you know, there's a Black Panther chapter near where I am. I work in the breakfast program. I work with Puerto Rican groups. So a lot of my friends, after they come back from Cuba, you know, speaking Spanish. You know, I've got all my wife is Asian American. I'm very active with Asian American. Matter of fact, one of the close families who I'm working with now to place their papers is the Kochiyama family. Yuri Kochiyama is the woman who cradles Malcolm X at the Audubon Ballroom when he's assassinated. She's a long-time Asian American. So I've got a history of lots of different involvements. But, you know, if you look with your eyes wide open, which is a Harrison phrase, you know, it's not hard to see what's going on, right? And so I don't want to focus too much on me, but
I just wanted to know.
But I'm working class roots. I got involved in things. You learn more, and you learn more. You know, in the situations you live and work in. You know, you get your coat pulled if you mess up. You know.
Yes. So let me ask you some prevalent today. What Harrison was talking about within the aspect that was going on within the 1900s, early 19th century, or 20th century here in America, and the situation now that's facing us right here now today, 2016. Why are we still basically in the same place where we at?
Right. Well, that's a good question. It's a very important question, and the answers certainly are not well agreed upon by people today. But I think what's crucial to moving in the direction we have to move is what I write about all the time, which is those who want social change have to understand the centrality of the struggle against white supremacy as to all efforts at social change. That's the basic. I come from up New York here. I know a lot of the groups on the left, and I'll see some of them, and they'll have their list of what they're opposed to. Down there, number 7 might be we're opposed to racism or something like that. You understand what I'm describing? That's not it. I think we have to start from that understanding. I think we have to understand that white supremacy and even these white privileges, this is some of the work I do, they are not in the interest of the European American workers. I know people get privileges, but I'm a worker. We go out on strike. When you go out on strike, you know, you got to stick together. You can't let the boss throw you $5 and you're going to...
You come make a
right. Or in the civil rights era, when people in front of those barking dogs and stuff, you can't let somebody come up and say, here's $5. And you're going to break ranks. We got to stick together. And that's what's got to be built. And the two main arguments, because I try and concentrate a lot of work amongst European American workers, the two main arguments that I have to take on, that, not just me, I think anybody, the argument that racism is innate and that white workers benefit from these racial privileges. And because if you think that their racism is innate, why are people going to fight it? If they, you know, if you can't
more
change
than likely,
it.
Exactly.
Right. And if you think they benefit, why are they going to fight it? And I'm very clear that it's not in their interest. And again, we did some very good work. We coordinated. I come out of a 4,000 worker facility in Jersey City, loading the mail. It was a big mail processing center. Even these things, there's a white supremacist history too. After the big 1970 postal strike, the Postal Service turned to a new hubs and spokes, like they do with the airlines, system, 21 bulk mail centers. This 1970 strike paralyzed Wall Street, which ran on paper back then. Nixon was the president. And they did a host of things, which I go through in some articles. But one main thing they did is they built a new system of bulk mail centers, 21, all named after the inner cities, but they moved them outside the inner cities so they didn't have that high percentage black and Latin workforce, which was in New York and Chicago, which keyed the strike in 1970. And so it was a conscious decision. They put it in places where there's 10% black work. But I come out of in Jersey City, Newark, we're near all those areas, but still they started out with a much higher preponderance of European American workers than in New York City. But we built work there. And in the mid-'80s, when the anti-apartheid struggle was big, we had 3,000 out of 4,000 workers wearing anti-apartheid buttons in a place that was still 60-70% European American.
Yes.
People who never in their life dreamed of wearing anything like that, right? So from past experience in work, I know it's possible. One other thing, just about the work experience. When we were doing work at the base in the post office, we would come out with a newspaper every Thursday, because when you go to fight this stuff, I think it's very important to be regular. You just don't come when there's a big incident and jump all around. You've got to be steady and regular. We would come out, back then it wasn't so much internet, we'd print out leaflets and stuff, but Thursday was payday every other week, so we did our bulletins on Thursday because we knew most people would show up, right? And every issue of our paper, we would we'd look at every issue in the plant, and then we would look at how, as I mentioned earlier, how white supremacy is shaping it. And so there'd be things like overtime. People, pay wasn't much, so people were hungry for overtime sometimes. And you go to some pay locations, and the supervisors, have a steady pattern, and the white workers get the overtime, and stuff. So we said, no, we're not playing that anymore. We got elected new union people, and some of these people ready to come to blows, right? Because you're taking money out of our, and everybody else is watching how long is this going to last, right? Yeah. But if you do that, then you earn respect. People come forward. We looked at all our committees. We had at least half black, membership, black leadership, the women's committee, the grievance committee, health and safety, and you're able to take, because the black workers in general are more advanced in their workplace, because they see through all this stuff, right? Okay. That's some of the examples.
Let me ask you a question. What was Hubert Harrison's position on religion?
Yes.
I know you talk about the church here, but...
Yeah, Hubert Harrison, and this is talked about in his diary and it's in all the books. Harrison became a free thinker. Free thought was current and popular in the early 20th century. Free thought is thought free from the dogmas of religion. The basic things that they believed was the human origins of the Bible. It's not direct, from God, is what they believed. They believed they turned to science to address social problems was the big thing. Okay. And Harrison is influenced by that, but he's influenced not only by the free thought movement, but by his own readings of the Bible. He read the Bible and had a lot of questions and criticism, because this was a period in the early 20th century of what they call historical criticism, biblical criticism. So he writes, and when he breaks from religion, it's torturous for him, because that had been his early worldview. Yes. And he describes this. But when he breaks, he says in the beginning, he says, well, now I'm an agnostic. An agnostic claims they don't know whether God exists or not, right? Yes. He goes, but an agnostic of the ilk of Thomas Huxley. Now, Thomas Huxley, for people not familiar with him, Thomas Huxley is known as Charles Darwin's bulldog. He was a big proponent of evolutionary science and things like that. But he also coined the word agnosticism. And for Huxley, agnosticism was a way of approaching issues, a turn to science, a method to it. So, and Harrison says, I'm of that sort. So that's when he turns. But later on, he's also writes some things very critical of the historic role of the church in terms of slavery, and how it supported slavery in many cases. It jumped and criticized the abolitionists in various places. But he's still also open, later. He has these beliefs. In his last years, as I mentioned Harrison speaks 6 languages. In his last years, he's teaching himself Arabic and reading the Quran, not because he's so religious, but because it's a religion of so many people of African descent, right? So and in his last years, his last organization is the International Colored Unity League, which again, to draw a parallel with Malcolm, is like when Malcolm has in his last years the Organization of Afro-American Unity. It's more broad-based, and it's not hostile in any way to church, and things, trying to bring everybody together. But, ideologically, theoretically, Harrison does not, advocate religion after around 1907. He's broken from that. His wife remains very religious. Church was right across the street from him.
Yeah. Any of his children still alive?
No, his children. When I started in 1981, his children. 2 of them I may have mentioned. William, who was 7 when Hubert died, and Ada, who was 16 when he died, were alive. And there was a sister in Arizona who died shortly after that. I never got to meet her. Okay. But the 2 I met in New York were outstanding. William And this is how Harrison passed. William becomes a Tuskegee Airman, becomes a lawyer.
Okay.
Ada becomes a school principal, a black woman principal in New York City in the 1960s, an extraordinary achievement. There were very few. So they carried on. And when she was 16, right after her father died, she was doing a weekly column in the Amsterdam News as a high school student. Yeah.
Okay.
So, but then now, since they've passed on, I'm in touch with still the extended family, and I had some of the pictures up yesterday, most particularly with the grandchildren, Charles Richardson and Ada Harrison, maintained the family name.
What are they like?
They're nice, they're wonderful, and they're very bright. And Charles worked in advertising for many years, and Charles did an article with me, and I want to mention this because I didn't mention this last night. Hubert Harrison's other grandson, Ray Richardson, Charles Richardson's brother. Charles and I did an article that appears on Black Agenda Report, Black Star News, and some of these Counterpunch about Ray Richardson. Ray Richardson is Hubert Harrison's grandson, brilliant like his grandfather, right? His father had been a Tuskegee Airman, right? And World War II, and then comes back to the U.S. so sick of all the white supremacy there, he moves to Mexico and sets up a place down there. He has a little place where people from the Caribbean, from the States could go and, a little bar, that, place that they could hang. But Ray Richardson is in drama school, in theater school at Boston University. He's born my year, 1946. And Martin Luther King Jr. gets assassinated in 1968. James Brown is supposed to come do a concert at the Boston Garden. The media is going crazy. They don't want Brown to do the concert. Public broadcasting has no black programming at all. They say we got to get some black programming, So they approach some of the film students at Boston University, Ray Richardson, Stan Lathan. Stan Lathan later does Sesame Street, but his daughter, Sanaa Lathan, is a very famous actress. You may know the name, right?
Yes.
And these are super talented filmmakers. Mm-hmm. So what happens is they start, Ray Richardson becomes the producer of a show called Say Brother. Boston got a racial history, white supremacy, right? It sweeps the black African-American community, people watching it all over, but it's got a much broader circulation. It's prime time, Thursday night, aired again, hour long on the weekend. And they got the politics. They got Muhammad Ali speaking on the war, and they got Funkadelic in the early stages, I think it was, right? They got all the groups. They got everybody. They got the dancers, culture, poetry, wonderful show. Then what happens, I'll make this story short, but this is important because this is accrution through one more generation, right? That what happens is New Bedford, Mass., a community with a lot of Cape Verdeans, and erupts after a police incident like we're seeing today. Mm-hmm. And for 6 days, there's protest, pretty staunch protest. And Say Brother takes the mics into the community and gives the community a voice. Not talking heads like we see now. They let the community speak. They go crazy at public broadcasting. They take the show off the air. They fire Ray Richardson. I'm going to make the story short. So what happens, Ray Richardson, he's fired. He can't get, there's still protests from a lot of the activists still active in Boston. He goes down to see his father with his fiancee, Vashti Lowndes, who's a talented filmmaker, video person with Gil Noble's Like It Is show in New York. They go down to visit the father. They're ready to leave. They go to Acapulco, and they allegedly die from swimming at Acapulco. They die from drowning. The both of them. And now please listen. Now this is the period when Fred Hampton, Mark Clark, we've already had Martin and Malcolm earlier. A year later, Whitney Young, after he comes out against the war for the head of the Urban League, will die of drowning in Africa. But so as I'm piecing this story together, the family never believes this story because he's a strong swimmer. As I'm piecing the story together, I go to the Boston Globe because they were working up in Boston. Mm. And on the Boston Globe, right under Ray Richardson's obituary is the obituary of Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz was the duly elected president of Guatemala who kicked out the U.S., nationalized the fruit production and stuff like that, and then was ousted in an open CIA coup that they bragged about in 1954. He had gone to Cuba for a while. He was living in Mexico virtually the same day as Ray Richardson and Vashti Lowndes allegedly drowned in Mexico. Jacobo Arbenz allegedly drowned in Mexico. Mm. But here's a little hook. he allegedly drowns in his own bathtub. That's the story. I mean, that's the account.
Whoa.
So nobody, and I think much more should be done on this. But Ray Richardson is a wonderful story, and there's some stuff about him in a new book that came out within the last 2 years, Black Power TV, about the early period.
Yeah. So it sounds like his grandkids aren't radicalized.
Well, Charles supports everything we're doing with Hubert Harrison, you know,
Okay.
and yeah, they're good, and,
Okay.
and Ada and Ilva paid for the marker and stuff, you
Yeah.
know. People have their different, ways of showing their,
Yeah. Have they come here? Have the grandkids or do you
I don't know. I think it would be great to have them. I mentioned to Charles, when I was coming last year, this one was kind of quick this time because I wanted to suggest he come for it was a literary festival last year.
Okay.
I don't know that they've come to St. Croix.
Okay.
It would be nice, but maybe, I'll talk to him again when I get back and
Yeah.
see.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay. So he passes on, and his legacy is.
Yeah. Let me explain a little why he's not better known, if I may.
Yes.
Would that be okay? Okay. Some of the reasons Harrison's not better known, as I've indicated in my talks, he's black, he's poor, he's from the Caribbean, he's an immigrant, he's a worker. If he were a woman, I would add that. Those categories consistently underrepresented. But also, he is a radical in the most powerful country in the world, and he's a radical on race, class, and religion.
Mm-hmm.
So they do a few things. One, they try to silence those voices, but they also try to promote other voices, right?
Yes.
So we've got that. Then he's a candid critic, as was explained by J.A. Rogers and others, and he winds up losing his job from Booker T. Washington after he criticizes Booker T. Washington. He puts forth a very powerful critique of W.E.B. Du Bois during World War I.
Yes.
Du Bois will never speak. And so people who should keep his memory alive don't. He has no long-lasting organizational tie. For instance, Garvey, after Garvey dies, there's a Garvey movement, and the UNIA persists, and they will keep his memory alive. And Du Bois, in his last years, gets affiliated with the Communist Party, and they keep his memory alive. Harrison doesn't have that. He dies young at 44, and he's not martyred like Martin and Malcolm, right? That's another reason. And then another thing, which I go into in more detail in the books, but it's how history gets written and who they choose to highlight and not highlight. But this is something that I think is possible, and I'm convinced, and when I do my talks now, I'm convinced, when Harrison dies, Arthur Schomburg delivers the eulogy, and he knew how popular Hubert Harrison was in his day. When Harrison dies, thousands attend his funeral. The young kids used to follow him on the streets. He lived in the community. But when he dies, Schomburg eulogizes Hubert Harrison was ahead of his time. John Henry Clark repeats that some years later when he does the introduction to one of Harrison's books in 1997. And that's true. Hubert Harrison was ahead of his time. He has so much to offer generations today. And that's one of the reasons I think it's so important we do what you're doing today. We bring more awareness of him, his life, and the struggles he and others waged, right? These are important struggles.
Definitely. We have some very pertinent issues here that's facing us here now today too, within our territory, that we seems like it kind of becomes, even too, we were having a casual discussion today that it had points here and St. Croix that people can't remember that there was signs all along here that natives were not allowed to go a certain place here at St. Croix.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could remember it.
Yeah, I remember.
But growing up here at St. Croix, and we are only 50. We only
in our early 50s,
young 50s, So a lot of people don't have a clue or don't try to suppress it. But it's glad that this is coming up now, that we could really, because the work that he did is what's happening right now today. It's happening right now today.
One thing, just to add to what you're saying, and that's very important, but these two Harrison articles in the book, A Hubert Harrison Reader. You write
Reader, right.
Two wonderful articles on the Virgin Islands. They're extraordinary. They're written in 1922 and 23, and they go back historically, way back to some degree, but he brings it up through the transfer, and all that. And he talks about the U.S. takeover, and he talks about the naval administration ruling things and how Southernism runs wild, you know, how they come. And he talks about the attacks on Crucian women and the increase in veneer. I mean, he gets in, you know, he mentions this. A lot of people don't know this history, and they bring the Southern ways, the U.S., what Harrison reacted to when he came to New York. They bring it down here, and he says it wasn't like that when I ruled, because he's in touch with people down here. I mean, it wasn't this vicious stuff like what you're describing. And he talks about that. He also points out, and his discussion on the reasons for and there are many reasons for the transfer, but one that he points out, which is important for people to know, is that the planters, the Danish planters, European planters, were, you know, after this growth of the labor movement led by Hamilton Jackson and others, they felt threatened, and they felt with the U.S. coming in, they would have a way better to control their black labor force, right? And Harrison talks about that. He also talks about, and you caught this last night, but when the U.S. first takes over, the citizenship status, he's very active with Virgin Island groups in New York in the 1920s with people whose names you know, Casper Holstein, Rothschild Francis, a woman named Elizabeth Hendrickson, who's very active with the women's groups in New York and some of these groups. And down here, D. Hamilton Jackson, Anselmo Jackson, who I mentioned earlier, a few others. My name is going right now. I'm doing this for 2 days. And so he's very active. And they're fighting, and they're trying to encourage people to fight and stand up there for rights. Because the Virgin Islands, when the U.S. takes over, although the U.S. takes over, they put the naval administration in charge, and they continue with the Danish laws, right? And this is, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Today we still got Danish laws in our books.
And Harrison says this is incredible that this can be going on. You know, Wilson says make the world safe for democracy. This is a joke, you know. And he talks about this and writes knowledgeably, and it's the kind of stuff I think the younger generation should know, because I don't know what exactly gets taught in the schools, but this is the history I think you want to share. And the other thing, of course, is he, as I mentioned earlier in some of the discussions, he didn't even know when he comes to New York, Virgin Islanders by the U.S. State Department were considered citizens in but not of the United States. And he goes, he didn't even know what that meant. When he had to register for the draft, they asked him, are you a citizen in the U.S.? He honestly didn't know. He doesn't become a citizen until 1922. I think many of the people who were gaining citizenship from St. Croix and from the Virgin Islands were people with the Danish ancestry who could renounce citizenship, Danish citizenship. But Harrison didn't think he even had citizenship. So when he becomes finally a U.S. citizen in 1922, and I think you'll probably throw up a picture of him at some point on this stuff, you can see Harrison is, his family is, as Rogers says, of unmixed African ancestry, right? Very dark-skinned, right? But on his immigration papers, he's listed as white. You know, it brings a smile to many faces for people who knew Harrison. But so he stayed active, though. He was very concerned about Virgin Island causes, and it's good to know that, and that he and others in the States were doing it. You know?
You've met their family, right? His family?
Yes, yeah.
What is his family like?
Well, I know his children were wonderful, and they were. The son dies within a year or two after I meet him because he was ill. But the daughter lives for another 15 to 20 years, and I would call her frequently. The story is, I think I said, I don't know if I said it here, but after I met them, I went to them, I said, I want to write about your dad. And I brought them some chapters I wrote, and they looked at me, and I understood, you know, and they said, well, you want to write about why, you know? And I left them the chapters, and we had 3 meetings. And then on the 3rd meeting, they took me into the front of the apartment on 150th Street in Harlem, where William lived, and they said, here, take these and do what you need to do. These were Hubert Harrison's papers. I was floored by their trust and but I was humbled. You know, I knew I had a major responsibility. And so what I did is I became an archivist. I inventoried them. I learned how to become an archivist. I got what's called Mylar. It's the plastic you put them in. I got the acid-free paper. I got the archival boxes. And I made one copy of the original, never touched the originals again because the scrapbooks were so fragile, they would fall apart. I made copies of all that and worked from that. When we ultimately then, after the children died, who again I stayed in very close touch, particularly with Charles, who co-wrote the book, the article on his brother with me, and we're still in touch. Charles Richardson, and they said let's place the papers, and we talked to all the major repositories, Columbia, Harvard, NYU, Princeton, Schomburg Center. They decided on Columbia. They got a large sum of money, as I mentioned. They got all the money, not in this money, but they got a lot of money, which was appropriate because Harrison is such a valuable collection. But the thing that's of interest here, and I want to also mention, because we might get some creative ideas down here, is I am now, part of my projects besides writing volume 2, by the way, I'm finishing volume 2 of a Hubert Harrison biography. When I finish this, right now it's projected to be the first multi-volume biography of an Afro-Caribbean, right? And only the 5th of an African-American. He is a giant, and Columbia University Press recognizes it. But when I finish that, what I'm also doing, I have lots of papers, all my years of collecting and my research and my activism. But I have not only all copies of all the papers that Columbia has on Harrison, but I have 31 years more of my collecting on him. So this is a major collection on Harrison, and I've been trying to work with Columbia, but I'm not sure what's happening there now. In other places, I want to get all 700 of his writings up online, and I also want to place all these papers someplace. But because I made multiple copies of all these Harrison papers. Already I spoke with people at St.Croix Landmarks and at the university to see if there's some possibility we get a set down here. Maybe we have some collaborative effort, you know, with the digitization. And if we have a few places working together, this might, you know, just take on more proportions. So I'm, in a sense, appealing to people down here if they have some ideas on ways we can get the necessary resources, human and other ways, to work with, you know, respected institutions down here for doing this. It would be great to get a lot of this Harrison material down here because it belongs here, and I think people will really appreciate it. And what's been very heartening, both in the talk at WIM and when I spoke at Golden Grove, and when I spoke today at the university, is the younger people. They really take some interest in Harrison, you know, and I think they're eager to learn about him.
So your talks at the prison here was on Hubert Harrison as well?
Last year we talked. Last year I came with a number of, it was during a literary festival, and some black women who were in publishing, and we talked about just writing in general, and encouraged people. Some of the people, you know, the inmates are writing diaries or, you know, little stories, and it's good. You want to encourage that. As a historian, I know how important all this is to record your history. It's an important story. So that's what we did last year, and then they wanted a little more Harrison, so we brought Harrison this time. And they wanted, and what was very good about the session was they opened it up so it was a co-ed event. So it was a little treat for everybody, you know. And again, people were very nice, questions were good, and the welcome was very much real. You know?
So let me ask you this real quick. Sorry, Soup. So what do you think Mr. Harrison would say if he was still alive right now? You know, just sort of a hypothetical.
He'll be fighting. He in the presentations, and you've seen this, but Harrison writes. I describe him as a radical internationalist, and he has a whole passage where he says, "Listen, if I was living in China or India or Jamaica or you know wherever I'd be living, I'd be fighting for more justice, and he'd be fighting in general for the people at the bottom of society, and for people of African descent." Some of his very important work in the 20s, which I didn't get into as much as I wanted to last night, but he started developing these ideas about international colored unity, about, you know, basing the work he would do amongst people of African descent, but Asians, people from Latin America, you know, extending it widely, and then emphasizing the need for European Americans to struggle against white supremacy. He goes, you know, you start doing that, you know, all doors are open, you know, we can talk on everything, right? You know, but he wasn't, as he was clear on one of his criticisms of the NAACP, he wasn't going to wait around for white support, right? Because it might not be coming. And so Harrison was very clear on that, and that's why he turned to concentrated work in the black community, founded the New Negro movement, his race-conscious movement. It was going to be, you know, self-directed. What
was his you know, he says that he was married. Any insight in his marriage life? Yes,
he's married. His wife, Irene Louise Horton, I was corrected because one of the good things about the presentation last night was one of her relatives came. Wow. And she says, because I had heard this stuff about the Demerara, but she said, well, I think her parents were in Demerara, but she was born in Antigua, right?
Okay.
And then moves to St. John, then to Puerto Rico, and then up to New York. So we got a little more connection on the family tree yesterday. So that was worthwhile.
Okay.
And I believe, based on the record, and I go into this in the biography, because Harrison kept his diary and he had some calendars and he marked off dates and 9 months and this and that. So I think his wife, who we call Lynn, that was the name everybody called her. I think she was pregnant, and so they got married, right? And that was it. And I think, I don't know what all goes into it, but I think Harrison felt a responsibility, and. In his own case, his biological father, was absent, and so we don't know what. So he does that, and they stay married for their entire life. But Harrison, and when I write the biography, I write warts and all. So Harrison has affairs, right? Including, I mean, not to make this, he has with a number of people, including with Amy Ashwood Garvey, Garvey's first wife. This is later after she's, divorced. Well, Garvey says she's divorced from her and stuff like that. Brief affairs. But he has affairs with women, and I think that was one of the things that was hard on his wife with all these papers that were left there, because she goes through this stuff. And one of the things I've mentioned, this is really getting anecdotal, but this makes the story a little more interesting. When Harrison, in his diary, that's one of the ways I knew he spoke or had some degree of familiarity with these 6 languages. He would sometimes break into Latin or French or something like that, but it might be when he was having an affair and he didn't want to mention the woman's name or something like that. And he says it was, for the woman's sake, but,
yeah. Did Harrison get a chance to go travel any?
No, well, because of the citizenship, he didn't. But the reason, this is a very interesting question too. He never got to come back here, although D. Hamilton Jackson kept not kept, but he wrote him several times. Says, "I want you to come back here and lecture and get involved with the labor movement here." He wanted Harrison badly to come. And when Marcus Garvey. What I didn't stress, I don't think in this presentation, is Marcus Garvey joins Hubert Harrison's Liberty League.
Right.
For people familiar with Marcus Garvey, he doesn't join anyone's
organization. That's right.
He joins Harrison's, and he's a big follower of Harrison. And I had quote after quote in the book and in the slide presentation from various people on Garvey following Harrison's lead. But by 1919, particularly after an assassination attempt in October of 1919 on Garvey starts to take off in attracting a more mass following, and Harrison's organization, for financial reasons and others, had dwindled, right? And so in December 1919, I'm answering your question, Marcus Garvey approaches Hubert Harrison and asks him, would he head the university that Garvey wants to start in Africa?
Okay.
And so that was why he approaches Harrison with that. Right. But Harrison very quickly says, I realized he really wanted me to edit the paper. So, and he never got to go because, again, he didn't have any papers. He didn't have citizenship. He could not travel. In the U.S., Harrison did travel down to Washington, Virginia, Pennsylvania, up to New England, out to the Midwest speaking. When he goes up to Boston, he goes up on a tour with J.A. Rogers. In the Reader, there's a series of articles he writes in 1924 for a black weekly called The Black Chronicle. It's a wonderful series. It's on the program of the International Colored Unity League, race consciousness, just good topics, meaty topics that people want to look at. When he goes to the Midwest, he meets some important people. He's doing some talking there. Virginia, Washington, D.C., and that's when he starts getting monitored early by the FBI. He's one of the first black activists to get monitored. It's called the Bureau of Investigation way back then.
So he was sort of being censored, basically. What he was saying and what he could say.
So one other thing I'd like to share with your audience, if we can,
go ahead.
Is the Liberty Congress. Hubert Harrison, after he forms the Liberty League, in 1918, Hubert Harrison and William Monroe Trotter decide to convene a Liberty Congress, which is going to meet in the last week of June of 1918. Woodrow Wilson had led the United States into World War I. Woodrow Wilson in 1916 was opposed to entry in the war. He was an isolationist. But within a year, he says, let's go make the world safe for democracy, right? That was his claim. Harrison, when he founds the Liberty League, the first protest, the slogan is, let's make the South safe for democracy, right? So and this is in the period, right, around the transfer, too.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
or let's make the Virgin Islands safe for democracy, right? But Wilson's not doing any of that. And that's important because Harrison's a contemporary of Wilson, and there are some people who will try and defend Wilson, say, oh, he's a product of his time. Well, Harrison's of the same time, and he saw right through Wilson. And he writes in some of the articles I cited yesterday, Woodrow Wilson was lying. These were lying statements, and we knew it, right? But so that's the entry into World War I. So then what happens, Harrison and Trotter decide to convene a Liberty Congress to protest World War I in the period. It's a major black protest effort in World War I. They're going to demand enforcement of all the basic civil rights legislation, and what's key is they want to demand federal anti-lynching legislation. Why this is important is a lot of people don't know this history. The NAACP was the largest civil rights group in the country, but for reasons that Harrison had forewarned about, they didn't want to alienate Southern white support. They refused to support federal anti-legislation in this period. And they did so, and they did not support it until the 1920s. So this was a bold move. And why did Harrison and Trotter think federal anti-lynching legislation was important? Because they knew down south they wouldn't get any kind of justice if, any attacks on a black person. But with federal anti-lynching, they stood a chance. And what comes to mind from a later period is the Emmett Till case. People may be familiar. A young youth goes up to Chicago from down south, is allegedly whistled at a white woman and is brutalized and butchered, and his mom, with such courage, open casket.
Yes.
But when the trial comes for the culprits, they walk in there joking and whistling to their friends and stuff like that and walk. So you didn't want that situation. That's why Harrison and Trotter were pushing for federal anti-lynching legislation. So what happens then, and this is important for today, what happens is the head of the NAACP in that period is a fellow named Joel E. Spingarn. Spingarn is a European American. The NAACP didn't have a black national head until much later on. And Spingarn is pro-war, but Spingarn is something else. Spingarn is a major in military intelligence. That's that branch of the government that monitors the black and the radical community. It's like COINTELPRO in the 1970s. This is the head of the NAACP. And he is also, by Du Bois's own admission, W.E.B. Du Bois's closest white friend, right? So the first big issue comes up in World War I. One of the big issues is the question of they wanted black officers. The black community wanted black officers. And they're agitating for it. And they're on the verge of winning that when Spingarn, speaking on behalf of the black community, says, we will accept segregated camps. Harrison gets all over that, as do others. But the big thing was this Liberty Congress. Spingarn and the NAACP didn't want that. They didn't want the Liberty Congress to happen. They wouldn't even try speaking to Harrison. They knew he wouldn't change. They tried to talk to Trotter. He wasn't going to change. So they decided to call a colored Liberty Congress to meet a week before. Harrison's meeting has men and women from 35 states, men and women. What Spingarn calls is a colored Liberty Conference. It's not even an all-black affair. They have FDR, who becomes president later on, but who in this period is taking credit because he's working for the Naval Administration, same one that's controlling St. Croix, taking credit for writing the occupation constitution of occupied Haiti. This is how he's making his rise to this is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. People don't know this about a lot of this history, right? And they have this conference to try and steal the thunder. But then they do another thing. Spingarn talks to Du Bois, who gets behind this colored editors conference, and Du Bois makes his own decision, but then Du Bois, Booker T. Washington had died. Everybody was looking to W.E.B. Du Bois to be the paramount black leader in the country in this period. And Spingarn talks to Du Bois, and Du Bois decides on his own to put in an application for a captaincy in military intelligence. That's the branch of the government that monitors the black and the radical community. This is staggering. Now, one other thing I got to mention, Spingarn, who's working in military, to this day, The NAACP gives their award for outstanding achievement by a black American in his name every year.
Wow.
The Spingarn Medal. People should know this.
Wow.
But so what happens? Yes, Du Bois, for the quid pro quo, in order to do what he's got to do to get that captaincy, he writes an editorial in Crisis Magazine, the magazine of the NAACP. It is the editorial he is most embarrassed about in his entire life. It's one paragraph long. It's called Close Ranks, and it begins, "While this war lasts, let us forget our special grievances and close ranks." Special grievances, everybody knew what they were: lynching, segregation, disfranchisement. Harrison sees this, and Harrison writes we could disagree on the war, but you don't have to take it there. Mm-hmm. Harrison writes a letter in The Voice, his newspaper, an article called The Descent of Du Bois. And he talks about Du Bois, his Close Ranks editorial takes issue with that totally, and then he exposes that Du Bois put in for the captaincy. Du Bois was discredited. That's why Du Bois will never talk about him. So Booker T. Washington gets Harrison fired. Du Bois never wants to talk to him, and there are many more stories like that. But Harrison was speaking truth and doing right, you know? So sorry, but I thought people might be interested in that.
That's very interesting to know.
It is, because the NAACP is they're still very active and doing this and doing that. Yeah,
to this day, the Spingarn Medal.
Are you honoring us with a intelligent man that was there to destroy the black community? So
yeah. All right, Dr. Perry, it is about 9:22 p.m.
You said we're an hour and 22. We did it.
We did it. Yes.
Well, we want to thank you for coming out. You know, as I said earlier, we had a chance to meet you yesterday, and your presentation was perfect. I got the whole thing here. I'll be working on that overnight. Good stuff. It seems like you just got a lot of knowledge in your head about Harrison and other key figures in that time frame. You ever thought about teaching history?
Once or twice in the past I did, but right now, I did. I have taught series of courses on Harrison and Allen, like 5-part series of things. We can do them.
Okay.
But I've really got to finish Harrison Volume 2. My tasks ahead: finish Harrison Volume 2, get all 700 of his writings online, and then I got Allen's key writings that are unpublished that I want to get up to. The guy who writes these I am very convinced that these two people are two of the most important thinkers on race and class in the 20th century, and that's why I encourage people to get familiar with them.
Okay.
You know? And one more time, if I may, JeffreyBPerry.net, www.jeffreybperry.net. All kinds of free audio, video, and articles on Harrison. And
a lot of information there. I looked at the website this morning. A lot of videos, and just a lot of 100 and something page PDF files. So there's a lot to read there.
Read the last 4 pages. You'll find it interesting.
So thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you both so very much.
Safe travels.
Yep.
And stay positive, stay strong. Soup, any final words?
Dr. Perry, continue to do what you're doing. Thank you very much for coming in, and I hope we could meet again to bring some more of this great knowledge to our people.
Yeah, for sure.
Rastafari Guide, One Perfect Love.
And I want to thank you both from the bottom of my heart. I genuinely appreciate you sharing this time talking about Hubert Harrison and the work you do. It's very important, very good. So
you're welcome.
Yeah, we like to say One Perfect Love is our prayers and his blessings. When you put it all together, you get one perfect love, man. So on that note, we're out. We'll be back next week, Tuesday.
Tomorrow, we'll be doing it tomorrow.
Yeah, tomorrow we got something lined up. We're doing a live stream at the Government House. But then next week we'll be back in the studio doing some more shows and some more fun stuff. So on that note, everybody have a good weekend. Be safe, be dry, do the right thing.
Remember, this is hurricane season. Be prepared. Get those documents in a secure location or a secure. What I'm trying to say, David.
Get your documents, your passport, your birth, all the stuff in the baggies.
In the baggies.
Yes.
Or put them in a safe deposit box before the hurricane comes.
Yeah.
Get the medication for the elderly and for the
medication,
younger.
dry food.
Your
evacuation plan, all that stuff.
Your route. Get your route in place so you don't wait till it actually happens. Just be safe and be sound.
Yep. On that note, we're out. Have a good weekend. Talk to you later.
Thank you, Dr. Perry, again.
Thank you very much. Go.